Well, good morning, everyone. I'm so sorry that I can't be with you there in person. Uh, I would also like to just acknowledge the work that everybody is doing in this space to make the lives of young people so much better than it otherwise could be. So I really want to honour the work that everybody is doing there. I do have a presentation which I'd like to share, and that will guide me through this journey. I also make my contact details available so that if anyone would like to reach out, I also make the presentation available. So any of the statistics that I go through, you're welcome to look at the bottom of those slides and see where that information comes from. So welcome to Transitions, and I think it is appropriate that we look at the transition process in particular for schooling, which is my specialty, because it can have such a profound impact on the lives of young people. So during this presentation, I'll give you about 10 minutes of information that will hopefully incense you and bring you to the realization that really we do have a school system that's in dramatic need of repair and restoration, if indeed all young people are going to be successful. And then I'm going to move on to a period of talking about an insider's view of how you can best support young people, or indeed young people to support yourselves, to having the easiest transition through the schooling process. This is my family. My wife in the centre is an educator of 25 years. I've been in education 30 years. And on the right of the picture is my eldest daughter, Zoe. Zoe was born, she was quite a natural academic, went through the school system, no problems with transitions, and ended up, and she's actually a young doctor at Monash Hospital, and has an interest in horses. So clearly strong genetic capital with my wife and I, and we were set to breed, essentially a superior race. However, as we would know, that one child is not like the other, and indeed our second child, she can't claim that I didn't give her anything, because I myself am a person with dyslexia, and I certainly gave her a fair dose of it as well. So she ended up in the bottom 13 percentile for reading, and essentially school was a trial and an ordeal, and it certainly brought home to me not only that each young person different, but just how traumatic it can be when you have a young person that doesn't fit the mould of education. Now she's gone on, she's in her last year of midwifery, and she actually runs her own business, as many young dyslexic people do, and she currently goes around and speaks to schools about what it is like for neurodiverse young people and how they can better accommodate those programs. Them in the programs. I just draw your attention to this picture. It actually appeared in a French magazine in the year 1900, and they were trying to forecast what the future of schooling might look like in the year 2000. And as you can see, they got some things right. They weren't doing too well on the old wireless headphones, but they did have some ideas. And indeed, the power imbalance and this notion of doing the same thing, injecting people with the same information, they pretty much got that correct. Here is a picture of a school that I took recently in Melbourne. And no, not really, but this is a picture from some time ago. And we often are critical of our education system, but at the time it was actually built for purpose. And that was not to educate all young people beyond a basic level of literacy and numeracy, but it was actually a sorting mechanism for those who would go on to university, etc. It was actually a good preparation for the future. You can see many of those same elements. And the education system was actually designed to teach conformity and a set of skills so that people could go into either a factory or an office space and have a predictable but consistent set of skills. And I guess what this highlights is this mental model that we've become trapped in terms of education. And, no longer is it acceptable. And certainly in a country that has 25 to 26 million people, we need each one of our young people to come out of that process feeling successful and confident through the rest of their life. And I'm acutely aware that many of you work with young people who don't fit this mold. So certainly in our case at the Future Schools Alliance, we're trying to liberate schools from this quite singular learning model. We are held captive by mental models, and we're sometimes also protected by them. But there is quite a common assumption that this is the success model, that a student will go to school, they'll receive good grades, go on and receive an ATAR. You know, many will go to university, get a job, get a mortgage, have 2.1 children, and that indeed is the good life. But we certainly know that for many young people, that is not an easy process to transition through. When we look at the traditional system, we haven't been doing well by young people, even on those base measures of literacy and numeracy. And we look at the PISA data, and it's been in decline for the last 20 years. And so I would put it to you that why would we continue to do the same thing, knowing that we're not getting the results that we would like? It really is time to change the system in some fundamental ways. Research tells us from the Grattan Institute that at any one stage, 40% of students are actively, or not actively, in some cases passively, disengaged from their education. And that is, you know, when you look at levels of stimulating learning and reported levels of learning confidence, they really are in decline. And we know that engagement in learning is one of those keys to success in school, and then carrying that on to future life. Australia is actually one of the richest countries in terms of median wealth in the world, sort of oscillates between Switzerland and Australia. One of the richest and wealthiest countries in the world, and yet when measured against the OECD, we're the fourth worst out of the 32 countries in terms of educational equity. And I think that is morally reprehensible and really does need to be addressed in a significant way. It's not about equality of offering, as we know, it's about equity. And that means meeting each young person where they're at and ensuring that they're able to get some success. I would invite you at the end of this presentation, I'm certainly open to being challenged on any of the information presented, and certainly happy to entertain any questions or comments. So when we're looking at the cost of this disengagement, and I know for many of you this will be a familiar thing, but in terms of the cost, in terms of crime, clogging the healthcare system and a reliance on welfare, and this is before we consider the moral cost of what it is to have a young person disengaged from not only education but in life, costing taxpayers in the order of $500,000 per person over their life. And the scary thing for me is when students actually took to the streets to proclaim as the Commissioner pointed out, their increasing distress amongst climate action. We had a whole range of politicians in particular pointing the finger at young people, saying that they had no right to be commenting on this and that they should be in school. So what to do to smooth transitions? So I speak to you as somebody who's been in education, as a leader, either deputy or principal in schools for 20 years. What can we do? What's the insiders' suggestions, tricks, tweaks to help young people succeed through these transitions? The first one is to encourage wherever possible a feeling of empowerment, supporting young people to take control and not believe it's actually the education system that is right, and in fact they don't fit it. It's important to explain to young people that the education system wasn't designed for all young people to succeed, and indeed they need to take control of their own education. We encourage them to get informed, to get some statistics, and I'll share some statistics with you in a moment, and to really find their voice and not feel done to whilst they're at school. I would encourage them to band with other young people who likewise, feel somewhat disenchanted by the education system, because there is somewhat strength in numbers. But rather than just sort of wallowing in it, I'd ask that they actually step up and take an active part in their own education. My experience is that in every school, no matter how small, there's always a supportive, possibly even somewhat subversive staff member that can support those young people, that can see the error in the ways of the traditional system and will really back those young people and support them to take control of their education. One of the things that frustrates me is there can be a sense of learned helplessness amongst young people. And so they're afraid to ask the question for fear of rejection. And one of the favorite sayings I have is, you're already at no, or you're at no now. So it costs no more to have that no confirmed, but you just might get the answer that's yes. I would encourage you, as well as having a supportive staff member, if indeed it's possible to get a parent support person there, and to sell a good news story to the school. All schools are looking for positive stories of young people that have taken responsibility for their education, that they've shown that they're not going to be victims of the system, and indeed that they can take control of their own education. So if you can encourage, rather than fighting the administration and the leadership of a school, if you can actually become one of their poster children for those that are perhaps not, your typical high performing student really experiencing success. The other thing I would say is, and this can be limited by financial means and also access to alternatives. But if it's indeed possible, and and a young person is not experiencing success in their given setting, by all means, I encourage them to move schools, because they are not the same. Schools are so unique in terms of their character and culture. And if it's not working for a young person, try another environment, because the stakes are too high. Young people often feel that they're always in school. I know that, as a young person, I felt like school was basically all I did from about the age of 5 to 18. And my schooling experience was certainly not a positive one, largely due to dyslexia, where I could see other students succeeding in things that I felt that I should be able to do, but my mind indeed wasn't willing. If you assume that young people sleep 8 hours a day and they're only in school for 200 school days, when you actually calculate that out, students are only in class for 17% of their waking hours. 17%. If you factor in the time that they have for lunch and recess, it only comes up to 22%. So my question is, what's happening in the other 78% of a young person's life? To try and, this is a piece of information that I do make young people aware of. So if that, 22% is not a particularly positive experience, think about what can they do for the other 78% to craft their own unique and happy and successful life. I have somewhat encouraged educators to get a small tattoo of 26% somewhere in a non-obvious place, as a permanent reminder of the percentage of young people that use ATAR. It was mentioned in my bio introduction that I'm not a fan of ATAR, reducing a student's 13 years at school down to one number. But when we look at it, only 26% of all Australians enrolling in an undergraduate degree use their ATAR to do so. It is not the only game in town, and one would have to question whether going straight to university for any young person is indeed, the optimal way. And are they not better off getting some experience of life first? Is uni good for all people? We know that statistics, and this is consistent across most universities, in fact, almost all universities, that 1/4 of students drop out in their first year. More than half don't finish their degree. And research tells us that a student who doesn't finish their degree, I just heard this morning of a close friend whose son has dropped out halfway through their 3rd year of their degree, but the research says that they will receive no benefit from that time, unless they complete. For many, going to uni, they go because there's a social expectation that that's what kids that get a high ATAR do, and there's this sense of fear of missing out on some sort of secret thing that happens at a university. My heart goes out, particularly during COVID, to those young people whose first year of university has literally been online, and they have had none of the social benefits that can come through a tertiary education. I would be encouraging young people to, if they're not experiencing direct success in school, to look for gaining a portfolio of experiences, to volunteer. And I know Tasmania, the figures around volunteerism in Tasmania are far outstrip those of the mainland, is my understanding. You know, is it possible to do internships? And, you know, I know we want them to do paid ones, but even unpaid internships can add to a student's skill set and their resume. Really encourage them to explore their interests, and interests can then transfer into passions. I generally don't speak to young people and ask them what they're passionate about, because in many cases the education system doesn't encourage them to develop anywhere near the depth of involvement that can build a passion. But if you start with interests and build from there, that's certainly a way to go. I would encourage young people to consider, particularly if finance is a barrier, what sort of things are available in terms of apprenticeships, of TAFE courses, certificates, diplomas. If they're in, particularly if these are in priority areas, they can often come at zero or relatively low cost. Micro-credentialing can be huge, but I would encourage people to consider whether going straight to university is something that we should even be aiming for even highly academic young people, and they're not better to go out and experience some of life beforehand. We often talk in education about students having a T profile, and what we're meaning there is that they've got a breadth of experiences and then one area of significant depth of expertise that they're particularly passionate about. We've then moved on to an H profile, because what we've found is, and particularly as you know, I'm not even sure of that word, robotics, artificial intelligence becomes more prevalent, having a single area of expertise is increasingly a dangerous thing to double down on. And so people are talking about supporting young people to develop an H profile, 2 areas of depths, and they don't have to be allied. In fact, sometimes the more diverse, the better. But I think when we look back as older people on our lives, we find that it's really an alphabet profile. It's not all linear, and we aim at a particular career and then we spend time on it. There are ebbs and flows. There are seemingly side tracks that we go out on that later prove to be beneficial. I went through an accounting degree, and goodness me, I studied for 4 years only to practice for 6 months, resigning 3 times in that time. But then in a later stage of my career, when I got into education, having that knowledge of finance proved immensely beneficial and enabled me to leapfrog many of my colleagues. So what advice would I give to parents and supporters of young people? The first is to get informed, and I'm a big fan of the information that's put out by the Foundation for Young Australians, the new Work Order series. They've got some magnificent data that really enables health professionals, people working with young people, to inform them, inform their parents. Parents need to understand that it is a changing world, and that old mental mindset, when we talked about what is the successful life for a young person, is changed, and it's changed forever. And so we need to explain to young people that life is not linear, that there will be curves, there will be setbacks, etc. Again, if you're a supporter of young people, find an inside champion within the school. It is just so beneficial to have at least one friendly face that can help a young person through their day, particularly when things go wrong. Rather than telling young people off, my go-to is asking young people in a really open and respectful way, can you talk to me about what your plan was here? No matter how little we can understand the purpose, generally young people had some kind of plan behind even the most seemingly extreme behaviour. So I'll often ask them, what was your plan there and how did that work for you? I talked there about microfinancing their adventures, and we are talking micro. To a young person, $100 can be like an enormous sum of money. And so even as a principal, we used to make a sum of money, which was, it was $20,000 across a school of 1,100 students, but we had $10,000 to $2,500 business startup grants to support young people to microfinance businesses, etc. And so as a parent, can you spare, you know, $100 to support a young person to have an adventure, to have an experience, something that they can then add to their resume? uh, Work out with a young person what their public face is. You know, if they haven't been successful in school, how do they explain that? What is their public face amongst their peers? What is their public face when they're looking for employment, etc.? Help them craft a narrative that supports what their journey has been in the most positive way possible. I'm a great believer in supporters of young people, helping those young people to rehearse scenarios. And I did this with my children ever since they started school, when they were, because transitions are not only when you start school or move between, you know, primary and secondary school. Students are forever transitioning amongst between stages within schools. You know, one of the strange and unusual things is that the education system seemingly resets at the start of each year, and you know, each year is a new experience. Now that can give young people a fresh start, but it can also reinforce that I've had 6 of these restarts. What's going to be different next year? And so, you know, rehearsing with young people about how they can show up differently can be a really great way to move forwards. Naturally, we need to monitor young people's mental health, but we also need to monitor their learning confidence and their confidence in life generally. The statistics around self-harm, etc., beg a belief. And you know, I think I speak to the converted when I say that we need to monitor those young people very carefully and support them where possible. The other thing that I would finish on here is encouraging moving from advocacy for young people as they become as age appropriate, to support them to become self-advocates, particularly with students with disability or neurodiversity. I have seen parents take on the role of tiger and you know, be quite scaring and intimidating even for the strongest of school, you know, leaders and administrators, but they never then transfer to allow that young person to advocate for themselves. And you know, somebody who's able to self-advocate through life is certainly got a great skill set. So I would really thank you for your involvement and attention today. I wish I was able to be there in person, but I would certainly welcome your questions, comments, feedback, etc. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Peter. Can you hear me again now?
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. We've had one request from a Deborah who would like to know if you would be able to somehow share your PowerPoint presentations in some capacity.
Yeah, if the conference is able to collect any requests, I'm happy to make it available to the conference, and that'll have all the research that's attached to that as well.
So we're just waiting on a few more questions to come in from the attendees. So please remember how you can do that with your question and answer. Should be at the bottom of your Zoom link on the page. We have had a comment from Heidi who is saying, given the state government restrictions on children in the public school system remaining in their catchment zone, so this is Tasmania, there are limitations giving children and students choice in that public education sector, and it also limits diversity within schools. Is that something that you would like to comment on?
Look, I think Tasmania is perfectly positioned. I have done work with various politicians behind the scenes in Tasmania in terms of the education system. It is, you know, in comparison to, say, the New South Wales system or the Victorian system, it's relatively small. You know, and I think there are incredible potentials for let's call it personalisation and individualisation of learning. I think there is benefit to having restricted catchments, but and the reason for that is you don't end up having schools drained. You know, drained with everybody going to what is seemingly a more popular neighbouring school, which can really residualise the existing community, but we should never be hard and fast. I'm not an advocate. For hard and fast rules and regulations. I'm far rather think that it needs to be nuanced, and we need to have flexibility. So if a young person isn't experiencing success in school, there certainly should be some avenue that they can make an appeal to trends, with the bar not being too high either. You know, what is the cost really?
Yeah. So another question we've had through is if you could explain perhaps some more about the differences between the school that you have set up compared to perhaps mainstream schools that most people are used to dealing with.
Yeah, look, my experience was a principal of a school called Templestowe College. It is in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, which is quite an affluent, sometimes called effluent, area. But we've also had schools follow this model, right in the most underprivileged areas around Australia. So it does work in both high socioeconomic and low socioeconomic areas. But essentially, the idea behind the system is to empower students to control their own education. So one of the key philosophies we had was something called the yes is the default policy. And that meant that any student, parent, or teacher who wanted to vary the program in any way, the answer had to be yes, unless it took too much time, too much money, or negatively impacted on somebody else. So we tried to remove as many barriers to students controlling their education and educators controlling their education.
Here's one that's perhaps from a parent attendee. How do we start a conversation with a principal when their world revolves around literacy and numeracy and risk assessments? How do we actually support them to be able to think outside the box and perhaps engage in some more of these holistic programs?
Yeah, look, it is a difficult question, and being a principal is an all-consuming
Not an
task.
easy job, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's not a 9 till 4:30 or 5:30 job. I guess what I would do is wherever possible appealing to the humanity of the principal. It is easy to get bogged down in regulation and red tape and objective measures of literacy and numeracy, but it's literally I think it's a little bit about appealing to their humanity and saying, how do I make this young person's life a success? It is actually an entitlement. They're not doing you a favor by catering to that young person's needs. It is actually a requirement that's legislated. So all I would say is appeal to their humanity. In terms of opening up their ideas to what is potentially available, I would recommend our organisation. It's an alliance of schools who are all trying to become more innovative and more responsive to the needs of young people. It's called the Future Schools Alliance. It's got a very low entry point, but it will expose them to ideas of how this can be done at no additional cost. That's the important thing. So, we don't have this flawed model of education because we're not spending enough. We're spending plenty. It's just that we're actually spending it on some things that don't have the return, in my view.
So, Peter, I've got a really interesting question here for you from Mary Ann, who has said, in terms of some radical ideas and ideas for change, how would you actually feel about removing age promotion to grades and particularly allowing for year 13 and beyond to remove the challenge of young people graduating from all learning and instead being genuine lifelong learners?
Yeah, and look, Marianne, hats off to you. You've nailed it in terms of our ambition should be to create lifelong learners. So my strong recommendation is don't make the final, 1 or 2 years of high school so abhorrent that they never want to return to an educational setting again in their lives. The school that I had no year levels. So students enrolled at the age of 12 and they could graduate in 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. Some would even remain for an 8th year because they needed it. So there was there were no year levels, and students selected education programs from more than 175 electives that they were able to choose from. Because we know in a non streamed class, there is an academic range of about 5 to 6 years. So how could a teacher possibly accommodate students with a 5 to 6 year academic range? So batch processing is definitely not a great thing in education.
We've got a great comment from John by the looks of it saying we've got Lord System Big Picture School, which is a fantastic innovator in that space. So that's a great comment from John. And also a question from Darren. How do we address the issue of a lack of services such as speech therapists, occupational therapists, and our long waiting list for families, and then the supports in classrooms?
Yeah, look, a big shout out to Big Picture. I know Viv White very well. Great system, strong supporter of it. I think they do some fantastic work there. I think that we need to look at models that embed health professionals within schools. Certainly some of the Future Schools Alliance schools make rooms available that they then have an arrangement with healthcare professionals that they can bulk bill anyone within their community. And so, it's zero cost to the school essentially, but a healthcare professional can bulk bill people that they're seeing. I know it certainly happens in terms of psychologists, etc., where rather than having a 6 week to 6 month wait to see a bulk billed psychologist in some of these communities, they're able to get access within 48 hours, and that's not only students, it's also parents. So I think there are ways that it can be achieved, but we need to locate health professionals within schools. And hats off, if you're a speechy, you're doing a fantastically needed service. So congratulations to you.
And another question that I'm interested in, it's come through from Hannah, and as a parent myself who sometimes doesn't like to be seen to be that parent that goes into the classroom and complains, how can we actually support families and parents who aren't the tigers, who aren't actually confident enough to advocate for their children?
Yeah, look, I think that is the sad byproduct of a system that doesn't respect the role of parent, where parents can be seen as a chore or an inconvenience. And I've seen, everything from, $30,000 a year schools do it to, select entry state schools to schools that work, in disadvantaged communities. It really is a reflection of the state of the system. And to be honest, I have little solution other than to go political, because that is the thing that's actually, it is one of the levers of change, and that's to either go and see personally, if, for me, writing's not my thing, so go and actually have a word to your local member of parliament and explain the situation and see whether you can get support that way. But
we've got a couple of elections coming up as well, so it now might be the time to jump on that pen and paper or the end of the email, mightn't it?
Absolutely.
Are you able to provide your thoughts? This is coming from an anonymous attendee. What are your thoughts on introducing life skills as electives and allowing students to make a college savings account investments?
I'm not too sure about the college savings investment scheme, so I'll just park that. But I'm happy to entertain an email if somebody would like to enter a dialogue with that. Life skills, it's very difficult to teach life skills in isolation. They really have to be taught in some form of context. Is my belief. When I've surveyed young people about what they consider the failings of their education, one of the key things that comes up is financial literacy. We teach a whole lot of, like, I'm a maths teacher. That's what dyslexics do, is teach maths, or PE. That's the other thing I taught. But essentially, teaching young people about calculus and so on is quadratic equations is a waste of time if they can't understand a family budget. So I think that needs to be taught as an explicit skill. But life skills, and we're all about the 21st century skills or 21st century competencies. They are best taught through practical applications, and there's a thing called PBL, problem-based learning. That is the ideal vehicle for teaching those things of communication, creativity, all of those sort of life skills, the interpersonal skills.
So speaking of, you obviously parked that other part of the question, but there has been another question from Ellen in relation to your suggestion about micro loans. And she's asking if you're aware of any organisations or places that support micro loans or funding for young people's enterprises.
Yeah, look, I'm not particularly aware of anyone doing that, although I know that there are a lot of entrepreneurs out there that will freely give of their time, and I would suggest that they may well open their wallets as well. But what I would say is that in education, and like mine was a state school, so we got not a cent of additional funding through philanthropic or any other source, and yet out of an $11 million budget, we were able to run $1 million surplus. Can you imagine that? $1 million surplus. And that was simply through some strategic use of staffing, which is your single biggest expenditure in school. And so, you know, what did we do as a community? We actually ran a program called What Would You Do If We Had $1 Million? And we asked the students, staff, and parents for their suggestions about what we would do with that money. And essentially their list mirrored that of the leadership group so closely that we just adopted their list. And, you know, interestingly, some of the things that they suggested, they wanted an extra full-time psychologist, they wanted a part-time social worker, etc. So, you know, young people are actually incredibly capable of making great decisions in their own best interests when given the opportunity.
Danielle says, Peter, this has been amazing. Thank you for being a light and leading the change. So a bit of positive feedback there for you, Peter. Do you have any specific suggestions for adapting current reading, maths and science programs in schools? This question comes from Karen. So she's asking if any specific suggestions there about how we can adapt those programs.
Look, I'm starting to get out of my area of speciality because I've been a school leader per se for the last 20 years. So I would be stepping into space that I'm not as familiar with. What I do know in particular is that, you know, phonics and a little bit of whole of word, you know, other ways to go in terms of certainly with dyslexic young people. You know, phonics is a superior system, although, you know, I'm not going to get into that debate because it's quite a hot one, hotly contested.
Yes.
Maths essentially has to be taught as a standalone in my humble view. I've seen people try and fully integrate maths. I'm talking more at a secondary level here. I've tried to see maths integrated. The biggest problem that we have with maths is that we move students through a predetermined system when they haven't got confidence in the basic building blocks. And so very quickly they get left behind, and then that just shatters their confidence. So maths has got a lot to mathematics, the way in which it's taught has a lot to answer for, but it should be only accelerated when there's mastery learning. And there are in fact, some really, really good computer programs around that can be done in a whole of class way. And I'm happy to talk to anyone about that.
Any teacher training degrees that you might know of that actually include giving skills that we spoke of about how to include and communicate with parents?
I'm not a great fan of teacher preparation courses, and I know that may upset some people, but it seems ironic to me that we, you know, we have young people, not only young people, there are many older people return or going into teaching at an older age, and yet we don't embed their learning within the actual environment. Why would we not have trainee teachers training in accredited schools that can support really good pedagogical learning? Certainly in the school that I was in, we would actually have teacher trainees with us for 6 months. And if there's any tertiary people out there that want to enter into that debate, I'd be more than happy to give you my opinions that education, they can still do the theoretical components, but the learning about education should happen in schools, working in parallel with educators.
Sanello has asked, how can we transition better from early childhood to primary education?
Look, the thing, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer that question directly about transferability, because to be honest, early childhood educators, they've got this stuff, like this is their practice. Like empowering young people is what good, you know, early childhood educators do. You know, as I mentioned before, I'm probably more an area in the primary secondary space and weighted towards the secondary. But, you know, I've been asked by people, when can you start empowering young people? And you know, I've spoken to my primary colleagues and I've spoken to early childhood educators, and they go, they're the very skills that we're teaching in early childhood. And we know, even in a learning sense, in a just a straight pedagogical sense, the educators that make the most difference unequivocally are early childhood educators. So I think we could learn an enormous amount by spending more time observing early childhood practices and trying to morph those certainly into the younger years of primary school. Play-based learning, hats off to or a big shout out to my friend, Professor Pasi Selberg. You know, he's written a book, Let the Children Play. It's a great read, and it offers you all the evidence, the supporting evidence of how best to do that. The other thing I will mention just about transitions, and that's into primary or between primary and secondary, is that parents, in my experience, and I have seen some data to support this, they are the best predictor of whether that will be an easy transition or not. So, you know, if you're a parent and you think this is not going to be easy, you're probably right. So listen to that gut instinct and reach out. Don't go, let's wait and see how this happens, because you'll be mopping up the pieces. Okay, reach out early. Longer transition, particularly students with disabilities or social, you know, social issues, contact the school early and ask whether you can have a longer transition. And most schools would rather do that proactively than dealing with the carnage at the end of the day.
Peter, I've got a long question from Sarah, who's asking, or she's saying she teaches a lot of early childhood primary school children at an art space and finds that a lot of her students that attend school are determined to do things accurately and or quickly, which is frustrating when I'm trying to encourage them to think critically and creatively, experiment and fail sometimes. Any advice to push them past these behaviours that seem to be praised at school?
Yeah, look, the system is rife with like confining learning to, you know, 45-minute learning blocks or, you know, 60 minutes, you know, having, you know, a margin that's 3 centimeters or 2 centimeters on the side of a page, and, you know, there's only one right answer, whereas life is complex. Life doesn't have right answers, which is, you know, to the heart of that question. I would just continue to fight the good fight within your art space. Love art therapy, love art for, I'm terrible at it, by the way, but love, you know, art in all its creative forms. And I would also have to say that art educators have been much disrespected in terms of education. Their contribution, you know, they often, the art space is often seen as a safe space within the school, you know, a supporter of young people who don't necessarily fit the mold. Many educators open their art space through lunchtime and so on as a safe haven for young people. So again, giving out lots of shout outs today, but thank you to all those art educators, and continue just having a voice. Do not feel like a second-class citizen to the English teachers, the science teachers and the maths teachers, which are given, you know, ridiculous levels of prominence in education.
We've spoken about that transition at that primary level. I've now got a question from Shani asking if there are any programs that you are aware of to help children transition from primary to secondary school and how parents can link in with those.
Look, I'm not aware of any specific programs, and to be honest, I'm a bit suspicious of bolt-on programs to any solution. I think every context is very much unique. Most schools, and this is backed up by research, most schools actually do transition quite well as a whole. What they don't do well is for certain individual students. And as I encouraged earlier, you know, if you know, we used to go and visit a lot of our students in their school and ask their teachers, you know, at a primary level, whether they suspected that this was going to be an easy or difficult transition. And likewise, as the parents, they too were pretty right in their assessments. So I would just encourage schools to particularly for their major feeders, and if it's not possible to, you know, like at one point we had 60 primary schools feeding into our school of 1100. And so what it meant was that sometimes it had to be a phone call rather than a face-to-face visit. But, you know, I think schools generally do secondary transition reasonably well on the whole.
And so that answer quickly then, do you think HIPPY program would help in easier transition to schools?
Sorry, not sure of what that program is.
Yeah. HIPPY, HIPPY, Home Interaction Program for Parents and Youngsters. HIPPY.
Sounds good. I like hippies. If I could grow the hair, I would be one.
A very quick question. Please repeat the author of Let the Children Play. We've got someone wanting that book.
Yeah, certainly. Pasi Selberg. P-A-S-I-S-A-H-L-B-E-R-G. Great educator.
A question that I'd like to ask, and it obviously ties in with the comments you've been making about your dyslexia, and I'm sure a friend of mine wouldn't mind me asking. Her son, who's in year 5, has just been diagnosed with dyslexia and has been told that he has skills of a 7-year-old. How would he have fell through the cracks he goes to a private school, and what would you perhaps suggest for him to be able to learn, to improve after all those years of falling behind?
Yeah, so, okay, where do I start with that? He doesn't have skills of a 7-year-old. He just has literacy skills of a 7-year-old. So it's, you know, it's important for that parent to reinforce. I
was trying to think of the word. It was comprehension, and I couldn't think of it.
Yeah, so that's right. So I'm not wanting to pick on your language, but for a young person, it's very important that they understand that in that narrow sense, you know, they might have skills of a 7-year-old. I wouldn't tell them that. Like, you know, it's not going to help their confidence or self-esteem. But if the first thing I would do is sit down with that young person and Google famous dyslexic people, because frankly, dyslexics are the ones that change the world. The neurotypical people are the ones that keep it going. All right, so there's a little plug. You know, and that's from Bill Gates, Elon Musk, all of these people, you know, Albert Einstein, etc. The dyslexics are the ones that see the world differently. And, you know, I would recommend, I'll just do a little cross promotion. Dyslexia Demystified is a great website, and it's got lots of learning resources on there. Essentially, with dyslexia, you try and improve their skill set up to the end of primary school. And after primary school, it's about using accommodations, which is like using technology for speech to text, text to speech, etc. Yeah.
Well, and Shelley's just also typed in, the Vice Chancellor of UTAS has dyslexia, so he's doing well as well, isn't he? He does, apparently, according to Shelley. I'm quoting her on that, I'm not sure. And just finally, because we will have to wrap up, a final question. I've got a few here, so maybe we might be able to get them to you privately or in another format. But how does the gap between private schools and public schools impact on a child's learning? Is that an issue that you've seen?
It's, well, the evidence on that is actually, like, I do try and not buy into the private-public debate, but the actual evidence, the research is unequivocal, and that is that a student doesn't perform once you adjust for economic, like socioeconomic and parental background. The system, be it Catholic, faith-based, independent school, doesn't actually advantage a student by going, you know, into an independent school, and that's independently verified, and not just one study, multiple studies. So you're not doing the wrong thing by sending your young person to a state school. But again, that's big data. You've got to look at the individual data. So I've seen independent schools work brilliantly for young people. I've seen them be a disaster, and the same in every other setting as well. It does come down to, you know, a sample size of 1. And if that young person's not feeling confident, if they're not feeling engaged and excited in their learning, it's time to change something, which could be their school, could be a class, but something has to change. Don't allow that situation to persist.
Wonderful. Look, thank you so much for your insights today, Peter. We've really appreciated, and all the feedback we've been getting. I haven't been able to read them all out, but it's all been extremely positive. So thank you. I've been told I had to wrap up you at 9:44, and it's just clicked over 9:45. So we're doing quite well with our timing. So a big thank you to you.
Have a great day, guys.
No, please, everyone can keep the conversation going on in Slack, which I mentioned earlier on this morning. So please do keep that conversation going.